Welcome back to Plantopia. Plantopia is the plant health podcast of the American Phytopathological Society, and I'm your host, Matt Kasson. I'm an associate professor of forest pathology and mycology at West Virginia University. This is the fifth episode of Season 5 of Plantopia and the second of a three-part series featuring 2025 APS Fellows. Today I welcome Dr. Michael Boehm, professor of plant pathology, vice president for agricultural and natural resources, and the Harlan Vice Chancellor for the Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. Dr. Boehm completed a BS in biology from Heidelberg College and an MS and a PhD in plant pathology from The Ohio State University. He also completed a postdoctoral training at Oregon State University with the USDA. Dr. Boehm's nearly three-decade career has been defined by his commitment to fostering collaborative and engaging learning environments. In his first decade, he led OSU's turf pathology program and established a statewide extension program. During his second decade at OSU, Dr. Boehm served as department head for plant pathology and vice provost for academic and strategic planning, and eventually special assistant and chief of staff for the interim president. During his time at OSU, he served as lieutenant commander in the U.S. Naval Reserve. In 2017, Dr. Boehm accepted his current roles at the University of Nebraska. His leadership has driven unprecedented growth in research and extension programs and has advanced partnerships focused on rural prosperity and workforce development. Dr. Boehm has contributed greatly to APS. He served as president from 2012 through 2013 and was instrumental in leading the Phytobiomes Initiative. He also served as a vital member of APS's Public Policy Board and chaired APS's turfgrass pathology, grad student, teaching, and women in plant pathology committees over the past 3 decades. Dr. Boehm is the recipient of numerous awards, including numerous teaching and mentoring awards from OSU, USDA, and Gamma Sigma Delta. He is also recipient of over a dozen military awards, including commendations and service medals and achievement medals. It's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Boehm today. And Mike, it's great to have you here on Plantopia.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. Great to be here.
If you listen to Plantopia podcast lately, you know that we're currently focusing on 2025 APS Fellows, starting last month with Dr. Tim Widmer. I wanted to first congratulate you on being elected a fellow in recognition of your distinguished contributions to plant pathology.
Yeah, thanks. It's a big deal, right? I've been a plant pathologist for almost 40 years, and APS is a key part of that. So the recognition from your colleagues and the society means a lot.
Definitely. Yeah. I want to thank you and all the other fellows for all you've done for our profession, for all you're doing for our profession and now, and all you're going to do for our profession well into the future. I thought we would start by giving you an opportunity to tell our listeners a little bit about what defined area you're receiving this APS Fellow Award for. In the last episode, we covered the fact that, some people are acknowledged for their body of research, some for their leadership, and there's other ways to contribute. How specifically are you being recognized and what area?
Yeah, so I think the two areas that were called out in the nomination were both professional service to the society, but also to higher education and agriculture and natural resources broadly writ, and my efforts in helping people learn. So the teaching and learning mission area.
Absolutely. So you kind of alluded to this, but what does it mean to you to be an APS fellow?
Gosh, I thought a lot about that since I got the call, and whatever, it was a snowy day in February or early March, as I recall, late in the afternoon, and I was caught by surprise, and that was a good kind of surprise. I think I just packed up for the day and went home and contemplated on the ride home. It's a big deal. It's just a small percentage of members that by APS policy that become fellows. And so to be in that small number, counted in that small number with so many amazing friends and mentors and contributors to our discipline is just very, very, very special. I think back to my early days in APS, and you're in grad school and you're not really sure which way is up and which way is down, but you attended the annual award ceremony, and those were the iconic names, that the papers that you were reading and citing in your work, and the mentors, and just the rock stars of the field. So yeah, I thought that that was something to shoot for. I grew up in an academic department that was just amazing. We had a lot of amazing leaders, a lot of previous APS leadership, presidents, counselors at large, committee chairs. So it was imprinted on me at an early age, my formative years, to be an active member of APS. And then most of us with our specialties are also members of other scientific societies, and that's great. But APS is that home for being broadly trained plant pathologists and appreciating the richness, diversity, scope of what we bring to the table. So from an early stage, I guess I was thinking that, yeah, someday that would be really cool to be recognized, and someday is here.
Definitely. For those listeners that may not know this, you served as APS president from 2012 through 2013, among many other roles on APS, Public Policy Board, Public Relations, and Outreach. The list goes on. Do you remember your first role at APS or your first APS conference?
Oh, I do. I mean, it's vivid. So I started grad school in 1987. Boy, that sounds like a long time ago. So 1987, and I went to graduate school at Ohio State University. And that year, the meetings of all things were in Cincinnati, Ohio. And for anybody listening to the podcast, they'll probably chuckle because that was a really tough meeting, logistically speaking. I think the hotel double or triple booked. So it was really pretty rough. And, it went off without a hitch. Ann Vitiver, as it turns out, famous phytobacteriologist, was president. I think at the time, Ann was really only the second woman to be president of our society. So, thinking about the last 38 years or whatever that it is, Matt, lots of nice changes in being more accessible and more inclusive. But Ann was the president. She stood up there, and as it turns out, 30 years later, Ann was here at the University of Nebraska. And it was fun when I interviewed for this job because after I got the position, I saw Ann and I said, Ann, you wouldn't believe, but your presidency of APS in 87 had a lot to do with my trajectory. So I thanked her profusely. I also, a funny story to kind of put in there. I was brand new, two stories, brand new graduate student masters. And since we were so close, a lot of us were able to attend. We had just started. So we took a van, the university van, and Dr. Larry Madden, world-class, world-famous epidemiologist, was driving the van. Larry had just gotten promoted to associate professor. I really didn't know Larry that well, but the whole ride down, calling him Larry, Larry, because that's what he wanted to be called. Well, gosh, it didn't take me very long. I think by the end of the meeting, I'm like, even early in Larry's career, he was amazing. I'm like, oh, that's Dr. Madden.
Yeah. But I think that speaks to our field. Like, there's just so many humble, fabulous scientists in APS. And, if you don't mind me saying so, you seem like one of them. I think there's just a servant leadership style where you elevate others and the profession above you because you care about the next generation of plant pathologists. You care about the content of textbooks and getting it right.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, gosh, I've had a lot of opportunity to engage with faculty, industry folks from all different backgrounds. And I would say each different department or college has its own personality. And of course, you can't take that too far. But I think, Matt, your characterization of plant pathologists as being fairly well-grounded, being very supportive, and candidly, proud to be a plant pathologist. We push the envelope. We think about the future. We expand boundaries. And we tend to do it in a way that really elevates systems for everybody. And that definitely is a hallmark. I'm glad I started when I did. Probably everybody says something like that, but man, it was a formative time in APS. It was a formative time for thinking about diversity, equity, and inclusion in science and the academy and in industry. And there were rock star women plant pathologists that kind of took me under their wing right from the start. And I'm forever appreciative of those groundbreakers and, of course, the allies that were there with them. And lots of neat changes. Biotechnology, this was a world before omics. This was a world before the World Wide Web or email even. I mean, it's a really fascinating time of great exploration and discovery, but also cultural shaping. And I think APS is a benefactor of all of those folks that came before. And I know personally I feel that way. And to your point, I think we all want to pay it forward.
Absolutely. And, I did my PhD at Penn State. And when I was there, Barb Christ was our department head. And I got to know Elwin Stewart. And, Barb Christ was APS president.
He was.
During my time there. So I saw that effective leadership. But the thing I saw that was even more powerful was how involved everyone in the department was with APS. And it really emboldened me to get involved too. So a little bit of fear of missing out probably, but going to the Northeast regional meetings, and I eventually became the Potomac division president. But that started with watching the faculty at Penn State in plant pathology serve those roles. And I saw the joy it brought them, but I also saw the connections that it brought with it,
You're spot on. I mean, that was my experience in the department at Ohio State. The likes of Larry, Randy Rowe, Pat Lips, Mike Ellis. There were a lot of folks going back in time that just, I think it was in the culture. And I am forever grateful that I had the privilege of attending a graduate school in a department that had that ethos. I'd like to think that a lot of plant pathology departments, or botany and plant pathology, or plant pathology and microbiomes or phytobiomes, whatever we're called these days, that is the MO. But I also have been around long enough to know that that's not always the case. And I think there's something inherent about the way plant pathologists go about their business, the way we engage with each other, that candidly, I can say absolutely isn't the case for all disciplines. And so I'm really thankful. And of course, you watch and you either emulate or you decide you want to go 180 degrees the opposite direction. And each of us is kind of a jumble of taking the best and jettisoning the worst as we think about how we go about our business.
Now, I know you've worked extensively in turf pathology. You've worked on biocontrol against Fusarium head blight. You worked on Pythium. A number of things come to mind: soybean rust, rice blast. Would you consider yourself a turf grass pathologist? How would you categorize yourself?
I think it depends who I'm talking to be honest with you. To some people, I'm a botanist. To some people, I'm a microbiologist. To those in the know, yeah, I take pride that I am a broadly trained plant pathologist. Absolutely. For almost 20 years, I was a turf grass pathologist. I really am excited by that. The work on Fusarium head blight on wheat was really a nice change. I was able to work on a inflorescence disease. And after having worked so long with soil-borne pathogens and the complexities of that soil microbiome, I was really happy to get up to the phytobiome. But yeah, I've described myself today as a grass doctor. And that's what I would say to somebody I'd meet in a coffee shop. What do you do? I'm a grass doctor. What?
So as a grass doctor, what do you see as some of the biggest threats that cereal grains and grasses? Well, let's stick with grasses. Like, what are the biggest contemporary threats grasses face?
Yeah, well, I think on previous podcasts, I heard folks talk about climate change. And for sure, as you're thinking about the range, as climate is changing, and you're thinking about the host range of any plant, in this case, grasses, what is the changing climate for every degree centigrade that we see? You start seeing shifts north and south in production systems, but also in native grasslands. For me, one of the greatest threats, everybody talks as a forest pathologist, you'll appreciate this, the rainforests and the cannibalization of the rainforests. But truth be told, Matt, I think on an equal, if not slightly more aggressive ill effects, it's on our natural grasslands. If you think about, what's going on in the steppe or the savanna, or here in North America, the Great Plains, we're losing a lot of these pampas in South America. We're losing a lot of these natural grasslands that are just as important with cycling and cooling of greenhouse gases and so forth, and temperature regulation. So That's not necessarily plant pathology, but I think as we think about climate change on these natural and on these agricultural landscapes, that's a big deal. Of course, when it comes to host range for pathogens and pests, I think those are top of my mind. I think the continuing evolution of plant pathogens, I mean, Mother Nature's pretty incredible. So always being on guard. One of the things back to maybe humanity for me is that when you think about grasses, I'll pick on rice, but wheat also is the same way, that for every degree increase in ambient air temperature, you see a 10% decrease that we don't know the reason why in yield on rice.
Mm-hmm.
So as we think about these staple crops, several of which are grasses, there are these really complex physiological responses to changing climate that we have no real clue about. And then when you overlay the complexities of the invisible plant microbiome and what interaction this microbiome has with epigenetics or with the predisposition of susceptibility or climate adaptability, I think that for me is both a concern, but also, wow, this is where our science is. We've got the tools to look at these complex interactions. And, having been around a while when we didn't have some of these tools, it's just fascinating to see.
Absolutely. I think a lot about Pythium and Phytophthora and oomycetes in general, like in terms of what's happening below our feet, but you can't help but pay attention to how the changes, not only in temperature, but the changes in precipitation patterns and how you'll have flooded soils for longer, which of course will be better for water molds and anaerobic conditions in the soil. So do you see a future where oomycetes will play an even bigger role in plant health than they're already? I mean, certainly there's a lot of diversity in terms of Phytophthora and Pythium and greenhouse and nursery settings that are dealing with that. But in the natural landscapes, do you see them continuing to increase and present problems?
Yeah, well, I've been with all this administrative work I've been doing, I've been out of watching, some of this up close and personal. But, I think along with what you're saying in my part of the world, I think about freezing and thawing, right? When I was a kid, much of the Midwest, especially the upper Midwest or the Great Plains, boy, when it got cold in November, it got cold and that ground stayed cold and it stayed frozen until the spring. It is very typical now, that you're not seeing the cold weather hit until December, sometimes as late as January, and you're seeing cycles of freezing and thawing, which not only have an impact on plant health, but also what is that doing with insects for our entomology friends? What's that doing with the ecology of the insects? But what's that doing on the ecology and the physiological status of the plant-associated microbes, some of which, being oomycetes, and certainly where you're having prolonged flooding periods, I think the oomycetes and some of the fun things like chytrids and some of that, not many of us spend a lot of time studying outside of mycology classes, but really some interesting changes in certain cropping systems. And I think we have the opposite, where we used to have greater water holding capacity. Drought is also hitting in interesting ways.
For sure. It was really interesting to hear Tim talk last episode about a chytrid as a potential biocontrol. And it just kind of blew my mind that,
Yeah.
Of course, I know chytridiomycoses and the impact that chytrids are having on frog populations and salamanders, but it was interesting to hear about it as a tool to manage invasive plants.
I had an amazing mycology professor. It was in botany department who was a chytridiologist. And I spent like 10 weeks, a whole semester, just really focused on chytrids. So fascinating. But yeah, how you go about studying really a tricky group of organisms as far as baiting them out of ecosystems. I'm sure with the molecular techniques, we can go and look for their presence or their nucleic acid, but getting them to grow and harnessing that in interesting ways, like Tim mentioned, as biocontrol agents or organisms is fascinating.
Well, so I think it's fair to say you've been a leader pretty much your whole career. You've served as a lieutenant commander in the U.S. Naval Reserve. You've served as chair of the Department of Plant Pathology at The Ohio State University, vice provost at OSU. Vice Chancellor and Vice President at the University of Nebraska. Was there always a desire to lead? Or is this something that you just kind of, it was a positive feedback loop, where you found out you were good at it and then you kept doing it?
Yeah, well, for sure, you should probably ask those that I've been entrusted to nurture their success over the years.
Fair enough. Fair enough.
I think they would say, yes, he's an effective leader. For sure, in the beginning, I think it's just who I am as an individual. I'm a problem solver. I'm a first generation college student, grew up in blue collar Cleveland, Ohio. And thank goodness I had teachers who really cared for each of their students, their learners. They saw potential in us that we didn't see in ourselves. They nurtured our curiosity. They were incredible in my formative years, and my college professors at the little liberal arts college I went to were just the same way. So I think that went along. There were some things that I found out, as far as a learner. I'm a visual auditory learner. I mean, obviously I read, but that was a lot of hard work for me. And so what I found was I paid real close attention. I took really good notes. I asked lots of questions. And I think sometimes that need as a learner to ask questions maybe was perceived by those around me as a leader. But as it turned out, I think that idea or that desire to help leave things better than you find them led to colleagues and peers and others saying, hey, would you mind? Hey, would you mind? And certainly when I think about my journey with APS, it was Ray Martin and John Moyer, two former presidents that somewhere around, maybe Steve Slack would be another example, Randy Rowe, they all took a little interest in me and asked me to serve if I would serve on the APS Financial Advisory Committee. So you'd asked earlier, maybe what was first leadership foray. It was serving on that committee, but that really helped me understand the finances of APS. And from there, counselor at large. And from counselor at large, the council was wrestling with lots of things like the structure of the council, the diversity that was or wasn't represented. And I was invited to lead a 2-year journey on how we think about the leadership or organizational structure of the leadership council for APS. And that was like the third time that people had tried to do it, and it failed the first 2 times. And so we had to learn a lot. So outside of committee engagement, right, as a graduate student, as in the grad student committee, or there used to be a committee, I think it's the diversity committee now, maybe, or the belonging committee. But back in the day, it was the women in plant pathology committee. And I had the privilege of serving on a lot of those committees. And it really does take a village, Matt, I guess, to your point. We all have to work hard and you have to be curious and make yourself available. But none of us get where we're at without mentors and partners and peers and colleagues. And yeah, I just kind of feel like, man, I've been lucky that people invested in me. And so key marker of my leadership is to make sure I'm paying it forward by investing in other people.
It's hard not to think that your 21 years of service in the military didn't play some role in your understanding of how effective leadership looks.
Yeah, my time in uniform, both in the Army as an enlisted person and then as an officer in the Navy, especially the time post 9/11 when I was recalled to active duty for a year and a half, no question what it meant to be a member of a team and making sure that you had your stuff together, that you were taking care of the people who were flanking you, but also those who you were following and those that you were leading, not only taking care of the team, but accomplishing a mission and hopefully getting everybody home from your mission. That leadership training was just fantastic. And while I had a lot of leaders who were supportive of me, I would also say I grew up at a time in the academy where you would hear, unfortunately, things like, keep your head down as an assistant professor, focus on your work. Your job is to get tenure and to do great science and teaching and extension work. So for me, the military provided a great outlet because it was just the opposite message there with the military. Everyone was a leader and you were expected to lead. And so it provided a great outlet but it also provided a great training ground. And I'm so thankful for the privilege to have worn the cloth of our great country for, like you said, a couple decades.
Yeah, I wanted to talk a little bit more about that because certainly there's going to be other listeners, other members of APS that are considering a career in the military, but also want to leverage their skill sets that they may have acquired. You were in the Army Reserves for 10 years, rising to the rank of Staff Sergeant. And you said that was enlisted. And then in 1996, you transitioned to the Navy Reserves as a microbiologist. Was that transition to allow you to serve and accommodate your plant pathology training?
I was a bit of an oddball. I joined the Army Reserve as a sophomore in college to help pay. I was paying my own way through school. So the military provided some benefit there. I also was a medic, so I wanted to serve in what I thought was a constructive, life-saving kind of a way.
Mm-hmm.
Along the way, I finished my bachelor's, my master's, and my PhD, and I was doing a postdoc with the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Corvallis at the time. And that was an odd thing for a staff sergeant to have a PhD. So, and while I loved being a medic, the truth be told is that I had heard about this program in the Navy that was around biological defense. So I was very intrigued by Tim's journey on the last podcast, just to hear his take on national security and so forth. But it turned out that in 1972, President Nixon signed a law into effect that basically said that the U.S. had so many chemical and nuclear weapons that we did not need to pursue offensive biological weapons. It's called the Chemical and Biological Weapons Convention.
Mm-hmm.
It was signed off by like 162 countries. So at that time, all the scientists that were working on offensive biological weapons, and we had plant pathologists working. So when you think about rice blast, or if you think about black stem rust, those were the first two offensively produced biological weapons in the U.S. arsenal after World War II.
Yeah, actually, about that, I interviewed Manning Gallagly for Plant, and he was at Fort Detrick in 46.
Yeah.
And he was working under Birch Henry, working on a rice blast fungus.
There you go.
Trying to find strains that were virulent and study their effects.
So sleepy little, back in the day, Camp Detrick. So we got out of the business is the point of the story. But what happened then is a lot of those scientists who were once in uniform pivoted to become USDA scientists. And both Fort Detrick on the plant side and then Plum Island out there on the Long Island coast was the analogous platform for animal research, which is now in Manhattan, Kansas, if you believe it or not. But the point there is that we moved from a biological offense-oriented position into a biodefense mode. So long story short was that the Navy had a really, and still does, a really premier biodefense program. So when I started on the faculty at Ohio State, it just so happened that the microbiologist in the unit that I moved into, he had since moved on, he was a part of this program. And so I called him up one day and said, look, what are you doing in the Navy? And he told me what he was doing. And that led to that almost 11-year career with the Navy's biodefense research program, which was a perfect place for a plant pathologist who had a research, teaching, and extension apportionment, because we were using all of the things that we use, a nucleic acid, immunochemical, culture techniques to look at pathogens. Now, the pathogens we were working on were human and animal high consequence select agents. But after 9/11, we needed to surge a rapid diagnostics platform out across the world. And I was asked to lead that charge. So we ended up training medical lab technologists from all over the world for both NATO and the US. We deployed real-time PCR and immunochemical assays forward deployed on ships as well as other locations. And we needed to extend that understanding and knowledge. So really the 3-part mission of a land-grant university that plant pathologists so embrace all came home in a major way focused on national and international security. Fast forward, Matt, to COVID. The fact that I stood up bioweapons testing platform after 9/11. I thought once in a lifetime was something. But when COVID hit, we all pivoted very quickly to figure out how we could use our veterinary testing platforms, our plant diagnostic platforms, to actually test for COVID, which, ended up doing that twice in my career.
So the 16 months you were active duty following 9/11, you supported a response to the anthrax letter attacks, sometimes known as Amerithrax. I don't know if that's a correct term, but
yeah.
Is that something that you could tell us more about, like being in that experience? I mean, just to remind our listeners, anthrax is an infection caused by a bacterium, Bacillus anthracis, and it's been used in biowarfare and bioterrorism since World War I. And you came aboard when there was basically these letters sent to news media agencies, Senators Daschle, Leahy, some others. Could you tell us a little bit more about what it was like being part of that response?
Yeah, well, I thought candidly it was a pretty safe gig to start with before 9/11. And in fact, some of the folks listening will remember that there actually was an inhalational anthrax death down in Florida or North Carolina. I forget. I think it was Florida Times or Florida Sun Times. It was written off in the news media that this was an avid outdoors person who ended up somehow inhaling Bacillus anthracis spores, which are not uncommon. Most of us in the community thought that was a bit of a stretch. And then it was kind of quiet. Then 9/11 happened. And then on the morning of 9/11, I got a call actually from our commanding officer of the unit that basically informed me that I was being recalled immediately to active duty. What you didn't pick up too much in the news media is that the plane that crashed into the Pentagon that was on its way to DC, that was horrific enough, but there also was a concern that perhaps those on the plane were releasing aerosolized bioweapons attack on the mall. So I was not there that morning, but we had teams on the ground actually doing environmental sampling for some of those. So I got recalled to active duty, and I think it was on the 20th day or so of being on active duty, I was asked to lead efforts for the United States Navy and NATO on biodefense, making sure we could take this technology forward, deploy it. The background, though, every day we were getting samples, not only from like New York City, but we were getting samples from all over Washington, D.C., and especially after Senator Leahy's staffers in the Hart Senate office building. You're right, both Tom Daschle and Senator Leahy received samples, but letters that had anthrax, but it was in Senator Leahy's office that it actually was opened, and millions of anthrax spores then in a white powder were aerosolized. So Hart Senate office building gets closed down. That was happening simultaneously with the other letters that were popping up in the news media. So we had quite the journey along with our counterparts in the Air Force Institute of Pathology and at USAMRIID up there at Fort Detrick, where we had a network where we were receiving samples on a daily basis. I mean, it was a bit strange. Essentially, Secret Service, Capitol Police would show up at our laboratories with biohazard bags with swabs and so forth and so on, and we would run our diagnostics. The thing about anthrax, which is interesting, is that it produces a thermostable, environmentally stable spore. And so candidly, all the techniques that we learn in microbiology as we're training, you can go ahead and heat that up to about 62 degrees centigrade. Everything mesophilic dies, the thermophiles survive, and it's a great selection deal for looking. Bacillus anthracis is easy to grow on blood agar, and the tricky thing about the pathogen, or the good thing about the pathogen from a diagnostic standpoint, is the biology is fascinating. It's got some chromosomal genes, but it also has some plasmids. And depending on the mix and the match of different genes, you either have an extremely killer variant or you have something that is completely benign. And in fact, if you're a veterinarian in this country or around the world, veterinarians are oftentimes immunized for anthrax, and they use something called the Stern strain back in the day, which is basically an avirulent, non-pathogenic version. So it was fascinating. We did about 16,000 samples And it was 24/7. And we would test for not just bacillus anthracis, but a battery of biothreat agents. And that was kind of the mission at home. And then we had lots of forward deployed mission sets where literally spent time on multiple continents, addressing the threat that you were reading about or hearing about on the news, from the Taliban in Afghanistan to what we thought or believed the UN thought that Saddam Hussein had in Iraq or in Kuwait, to working with NATO in NATO forces. It was a fascinating trip for a plant pathologist to be involved in. And again, I think that kind of shows the broad training of plant pathologists. If you know how to work with microbes, you can work on human, animal, and plant pathogens using the same techniques. It's pretty incredible.
Yeah. I like the fact too that although COVID caught us off guard, I think having dealt with that for the 16 months that you were active duty, it was probably hard to startle you or shake you up the way that something like that would have. So even coming into COVID and shifting, you kind of had the training to set, it was muscle memory for you.
Yeah.
You were just okay, I will go into administrative mode or kind of I'll deploy this type of test or these types of protocols, and I know how to do this.
Yeah, not only know-how, but it was great because, the Plant Diagnostic Network, the national NPDN, and then there's also an animal high consequence pathogen network, a National Animal Laboratory Network, or NALM. So the benefits of post 9/11 were the stand-up of these national detection systems, and then systems like Eden and so forth, where we increase our communication of what was happening. So we were well prepared in 2020 as a nation to literally mobilize more quickly. The laboratory response network in the hospitals would be a lot like NPDN. And I think people were just primed. The pump was primed. So we had that muscle memory and we had the network. So we knew who to call. And I was just as curious and scared by this new pathogen that none of us really knew too much about, that, just like everybody else. But yeah, I'm glad I was able to serve in that capacity as well. It was an interesting chapter in my life, that's for sure.
Yeah, well, thank you again for your service. Do you still hold top secret clearance, or is that something you have to give up when you retire from the military?
Yeah, so I retired in 2005 and my clearance was negated at that point. But at the University of Nebraska, where I am now, we have one of 14 university affiliated research centers. They're called UARCs. And ours here is called the National Strategic Research Institute. And the way these DoD platforms work, there's a command that your university partners with. So in Nebraska, we have the U.S. Strategic Command. So this is the weapons of mass destruction platform. Most people think about STRATCOM as the nuclear trident. It's in Omaha, Nebraska as the platform. But as it goes, I was able to reinstitute my clearance. And so I still have an active clearance and I do work with the UARC. And also it's helpful with the national labs and some of the platforms like DARPA. It just comes in handy when you're thinking about some of the research that involves plants and plant-associated microbes from a national security standpoint.
Right, right. Well, I want to pivot a little bit here. It's hard not to notice the sheer number of teaching awards you've received. I counted 7 alone that include the word teaching, but you've also chaired APS's teaching committee. Now as a top administrator at University of Nebraska, I imagine you don't get to teach formally in the classroom too often. Do you miss it? And what classes did you enjoy teaching the most?
Yeah, I've been waiting and waiting and waiting. And I think this next spring, I will dust off the course that I had the privilege of teaching at Ohio State on bioterrorism and biosecurity. That was a fun class because I also had a colleague in psychology who was teaching about the psychology of terrorism. So I'm ready to get back into the classroom on that front. Again, kind of an interesting gig for a plant pathologist, but it speaks to the position that most of us can play if given the opportunity. So tease everybody, it's not a how-to class. It's really think about, CSI meets the profilers, if you will. So my colleagues in psychology are talking about what are the state and non-state operators when you think about targeted violence and terrorism. So they handle that piece. I handle the biology. So if you think about maybe a general plant pathology course where you're learning about the different pathogen groups, it's a neat class because we've got political science, policy people, we've got communications folks, we've got just a cross section of individuals. So you get a chance to basically take what you might teach in a general plant path course and bring it online, but with a focus that quickly goes beyond plant pathogens into animal and human pathogens. And then you start mixing and matching terror organizations with different approaches that they use. And you think about offense, but also on defense. So I love teaching that class. I taught that until I moved here. So I'm ready to dust that off. I do teach in guest sessions on this topic. My passion for biological control has never gone very far, so I try to stay on the literature on that point. Of course, being in Nebraska with the Nebraska Sandhills and the Great Plains. So if you think about mining microbes, plant-associated microbes, and thinking about the bioeconomy, it's fascinating. And so yeah, there are lots of things that I keep my hands in as vice president, vice chancellor. I get to engage with almost 600 faculty. And the most fun part of my job is to engage and learn about what they're doing. And so you kind of stay intellectually curious and on point through other individuals. I think Tim said it nicely, as he moved into that national program leader position. The further you move from the bench or the field or from the classroom or the laboratory or the studio, you can get rusty, but these jobs are nice in that you get to see a lot of what's going on. And of course, our APS journals and webinars and that kind of stuff help keep you pretty constant. But yeah, once a teacher, once a supporter of other people's learning, I think that's the way it is. Once a researcher and a scholar, you don't forget how to ride the bike.
Sure. And, I recognize that teaching comes in a lot of different forms. And certainly I was really impressed by your series of OSU Extension fact sheets you co-authored back in 2017. Was that part of a course? Because they're really informative and they're really wonderful teaching devices.
Yeah, thanks. That was a fun series to put together. In fact, I think the 2017 iteration was maybe like the second iteration. So I was the person responsible for teaching the introductory plant pathology course, and I had a three-way split. I had a three-way split my entire career, and I loved it. Most people run from those, but man, my teaching was informed by my extension informed my research informed my extension. I mean, it was just really terrific. So I just was maybe lazy, Matt. I wanted to develop my notes that I used in my class. I put them in fact sheet form, and I could then use them for online teaching, but also for engaging with professionals in the field, but also with my students. And so it was a neat series. I think there were 10 in total. And the other thing I loved about that is I'm dangerous that I know a little bit nematology and a little bit bacteriology and a little bit of oomycetology and so forth and so on. But what this allowed me to do was to really build tighter relationships with my colleagues who were deep subject matter experts who oftentimes taught graduate level courses, but didn't get the chance to engage with undergraduates. And so this was a bridge, a cultural brokering that brought more people into engaging with a broader array of learners. Thanks for calling that out. I haven't thought about those in a while, but it brings a smile to my face.
Sure. And I'll provide links to an example one or two in the show notes for the podcast because I think they're really nice. I just want to push back a little bit on the word lazy because, you did something we call the double dip. In academia, if you're not getting credit in two different areas for one deliverable, then you're not being efficient with your time.
That's the only way I figured out to survive, Matt.
So, I appreciate your double dip there. You get a little bit of extension credit, you get teaching credit, you provide resources for colleagues that come along and say, where do I start? You say, well, it generated these beautiful 10-part series. If you want to know about lichens or parasitic plants or nematodes or phytobacteriology, here you go.
Yeah.
Thinking about your current role as administrator? Certainly, you said the further you get away from the bench and you become rusty, but it also gives you a 10,000-foot view of academia. And certainly, there's a lot of changes happening. Where do you see our profession going, and what role will universities serve in the future?
Yeah, lots of things. Your question reminds me of a quote, and it's been attributed to a number of people, but the first time I saw it was on a poster at President Gee when he was at Ohio State the second time. I had the chance to work closely with him, and it was just a poster that said something like, if you don't like change, you're really going to dislike extinction.
Right.
And so all of the things we think about, change is hard. So I think higher education, like everything else, is constantly evolving. Our science is constantly evolving. I like old books, so I have lots and lots of old plant pathology and botany books, and I go back, and the other adage is true. The more things change, the more they stay the same. So they might call it soil tilth. Today we call it soil health. I think we were talking about the same thing over a 200-year period, and now we have the tools. So higher ed's changing. I think, like everything, Bear's Law, that rate of change, it's changing so fast. Certainly, there are things like COVID, which accelerate and not only accelerate change, but also shine a bright light on where our fragility is and where there are gaps. Certainly, there's no question any person in higher education that I visit with post January 20th, the rate of change and the dynamics through the various executive orders and DOGE. And when you think about, most of our states are budget strapped, and higher education, especially if it's public, are in dynamic tension with lots of other spending needs at the state level. Many of our institutions have become dependent on student enrollment and tuition and fees, and trends like housing and dining since about 2008 cost more than tuition.
Yeah.
So we've got a lot of things that feel upside down to me in higher education. And part of the allure of being in higher ed administration is that you get a shot at understanding those things and changing some of those. I think probably, at least in the US, the conversation that's taking place about the questioning of institutions, I mean, just about every institution that you think about is getting hammered, and higher education is definitely getting hammered. And this narrative around the value of a 4-year degree, I think when I think about learning, I think about a continuum of learning that starts at early childhood and goes all the way to end of life. I think our universities and colleges are really traditionally focused on like the 18 to 25 or 18 to 27 year crowd. I think we need to open that can opener, and it's happening all over the country. We need to embrace and blur the lines with our PK through 12 school districts. We need to fully embrace our community and technical colleges. We need to think about engaging learners for upskill opportunities when they're in the prime of their working life. I think there always will be a place for residential 18 to 25-year-olds, but the reality is we're caught right now. And I think there are great examples like the University of Southern New Hampshire commercials, or if you take a look at Oregon State with their e-campus, their extended campus, or University of Maryland or Penn State. You know, Penn State and Maryland started with correspondence courses, and they've evolved. Their world campus at Purdue. I think there are lots of examples of universities thinking more broadly, but not for credit, badging. I think there's a lot of cool stuff going on in the academy. I also think there's a lot of scary stuff that's happening. I think I'm very concerned about our early career professional colleagues. Our graduate students are feeling the pinch.
Yeah.
The halting, terminating of grant panels, the whole conversation around F&A, even though it's a negotiating tool, I think it is having real economic impacts. Then you throw in diversity, equity, and inclusion, which, you know, I appreciate. APS has always been a proponent of access and that every person and every interaction matters. I credit my time on APS Council, and as a member of APS, it's a serious group of professionals that understand how important access and belonging is. And we're not afraid of walking that talk, but all of that is under assault right now. And I'm confident that this too shall pass, but we are going to have to be wickedly creative and clever as we navigate the current situation. And we are going to have to compromise and concede a bit on how we talk about the work that we're doing and how we align it with this administration's priorities.
Right.
And some people don't want to hear that.
But to speak to the early career part of it, one of the things we often talk about in plant pathology and ecosystem health, we talk about ecosystem resilience or plant community resilience. How do we build resilient training pipelines that can withstand the financial pressures and the huge shift in public service opportunities ahead of us? I mean, as a PI who's getting ready to graduate 2 PhD candidates, I think, well, I've trained them, but there's no opportunities for them now. And it scares me. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think this is another thing that APS, during my time associated with it for decades, has done a great job when you think about the industry, whatever it's called in today's vernacular, but industry relations.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. From when I was a graduate student to when you were a graduate student to those graduate students who are graduating out of your program right now, I mean, numbers I've seen is only about 50% of the graduate students. Now, this isn't just plant pathology, but 50% of the graduate students pursuing a PhD, only half want to be like you and me, Matt. The other half, they want a different career. They want to work for an NGO. They want to work for government. They want to start their own company. They want to be entrepreneurial. They want to work at a community college and have a better work-life balance than maybe what they witnessed. So I think the opportunity that I see here is really for those of us in these large land grant, which is where most plant pathology programs lie, is that we need to get comfortable being uncomfortable. In other words, I think we need to engage learners. We need to engage employers in a whole different way. We need public-private partnerships with industry and government offices. So taking internships and externships, we have to critically address how graduate students are funded, especially now with the federal funding tightness. We have an archaic, and we've known this for decades, an archaic funding approach for graduate education in this country.
Mm-hmm.
And we have to think radically different. And there are some glimpses of places that are thinking differently, and we would all be well to look at some of those case studies. And then this falls on people like me, opening up the bureaucratic administrivia to be curious and run pilots that allow us to explore different ways of doing things.
Yeah. And there's plenty of things outside of our control. I, for a long time, have been really adamant about outreach. And I'm not talking about inreach, but stepping outside the walls of the ivory tower and really connecting with the general public and talking with them and not at them and meeting people where they are. And I think that decades of not doing that had some negative impacts on academia as a whole.
I think that comes back to that narrative on the value of a 4-year degree. Not only is debt, total debt, but I think, the land grants, we can't be ivory towers. And that's the power of our 3-legged stool of extending that knowledge, engaging with learners. If we lose relevance with those that help us support the programs that we care about, we're dead in the water. And I think there's a recognition of that now. And I think we're seeing that shift, which gets back to life within a department. A department should be extraordinary in their research and scholarship and discovery, but also in their learning and teaching and their extension missions, and a deep appreciation for those 3 mission areas. And I think, again, most plant pathologists have a pretty deep appreciation, even if they are 90% research. There's an appreciation for those that are teaching or extending that knowledge. And I think that's another special dynamic of being a plant pathologist.
Absolutely. Well, we're about out of time here. So I just wanted to say thank you for joining us on Plantopia. It's been great getting to know you a little bit better, but also allowing our listeners to get to know you a little bit better. And best of luck as you go to accept your APS Fellow Award in Hawaii. And thank you so much for your time.
Matt, thanks. What a special opportunity and a privilege to be able to share a little bit. And thanks for your story and thanks for your leadership. And I'm always so hopeful when I get to talk to the next generation of difference makers and those graduate students that you're sending out into the world. While it may feel a little confusing about where they'll land, keep up the good work. And it's just a real privilege and an honor to be a part of APS and to receive this Fellows Award.
Thanks. We've just heard from Dr. Michael Boehm, Professor of Plant Pathology, Vice President for Agriculture and Natural Resources, and the Harlan Vice Chancellor for the Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources at the University of Nebraska, Lincoln. As always, be sure to check out the show notes for this and other episodes immediately following the episode descriptions. I'm Matt Kasson, host of Plantopia. Thanks for listening.